Welcome back, everyone. We're glad to have you here with us. Tonight, we take you into the Nevada desert of 1997, where one man claimed to have done the impossible. Jerry Freeman, an amateur archaeologist from Phoenix, said he spent 7 days inside the most restricted military facility in America. Not as a worker, not as a guest, but as an uninvited observer, hidden in plain sight within the boundaries of Area 51. Was Jerry Freeman a masterful infiltrator who witnessed secrets the government never intended him to see? Or was his account the product of desert heat and an overactive imagination? You decide. Share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's follow Jerry's footsteps into the Forbidden Zone and discover what he claimed to have seen during his week inside America's most guarded secret. Chapter 1: The Desert Wanderer. Jerry Freeman had always been drawn to the secrets buried beneath desert sands. A man in his early 40s with weathered hands and squinting eyes earned from decades under the Arizona sun, he spent his weekends hunting for pottery shards and arrowheads in the remote corners of the Southwest. To his neighbors in Phoenix, he was simply the quiet guy who worked at the county surveyor's office and disappeared into the wilderness every chance he got. But Freeman saw himself differently. He believed he was an archaeologist in the truest sense, uncovering pieces of a puzzle that stretched back thousands of years. His small apartment was filled with carefully catalogued finds. Anasazi pottery fragments, Hohokam shell jewelry, and stone tools that spoke of civilizations that had thrived and vanished long before European settlers arrived. Each discovery felt like a conversation with the past, a whisper from people who had walked these lands when the night sky held different mysteries. It was in 1995 that Freeman's focus shifted from ancient peoples to something far more controversial. A friend had handed him a videotape, a grainy recording of a man named Bob Lazar being interviewed about his alleged work at a facility near Area 51. Freeman watched it once, then twice, then a dozen times more. Lazar spoke of flying discs, of propulsion systems that defied known physics, of technology that wasn't built by human hands. Most people dismissed Lazar as a fraud or a fantasist, but Freeman heard something different in the man's voice. The same quiet certainty he'd learned to recognize in the stories told by Hopi elders about star people who had visited their ancestors. The same matter-of-fact tone used by Navajo guides when they pointed to petroglyphs that seemed to depict beings descending from the sky. For months, Freeman couldn't shake the connection. His weekend expeditions began to include stops at reservations where he asked careful questions about ancient stories of visitors from above. The elders spoke in metaphors and symbols, but the themes were consistent. Beings of light who had taught their ancestors about astronomy, agriculture, and the movement of celestial bodies. Teachers who had come from the stars and would one day return. Freeman started to see his archaeological work in a new light. What if the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of ancient peoples hadn't developed in isolation? What if the precise alignments of ruins with star patterns weren't just spiritual symbolism, but records of actual contact? And what if that contact was still happening, hidden away in places like Area 51? By 1996, Freeman's interest had grown into something closer to obsession. He began collecting every piece of information he could find about the Nevada base: declassified documents that mentioned Groom Lake, testimonies from alleged witnesses, maps showing the restricted airspace and the network of dirt roads that disappeared into the desert. He subscribed to UFO newsletters, not for the sensational stories, but for the careful research conducted by investigators who approached the subject with scientific rigor. The more Freeman learned, the more convinced he became that Area 51 represented the modern continuation of an ancient story. If extraterrestrial visitors had been coming to Earth for millennia, leaving traces in the archaeological record, then a facility dedicated to studying alien technology made perfect sense. It would be the logical place where past and present converged, where ancient mysteries met contemporary science. Freeman's friends and colleagues began to worry about his new direction. The man who had once been content cataloguing pottery shards now spent hours poring over satellite images of Nevada's restricted zones. His conversations shifted from discussions of carbon dating and stratigraphy to theories about government cover-ups and alien reverse engineering programs. Some thought he was having a midlife crisis. Others suspected the desert sun had finally gotten to him. But Freeman saw his path clearly. Just as he had dedicated years to understanding the Anasazi and Hohokam through their artifacts, he would find a way to study the modern mystery of Area 51. The difference was that this archaeological site was still active, still occupied, still adding new layers to its story every day. The idea came to him gradually, like the slow emergence of a pot rim from wind-blown sand. If he could observe an ancient settlement and piece together its secrets from pottery fragments and post holes, why couldn't he apply the same skills to a contemporary site? Area 51 was, in essence, an active archaeological dig waiting to be studied. The challenge was that this particular site came with armed guards and restricted airspace. Freeman began planning what he privately called the greatest archaeological expedition of the modern era. Just as Heinrich Schliemann had defied conventional wisdom to find Troy, Freeman would find a way to document what he believed was the most significant site of human extraterrestrial contact in history. The fact that it was illegal to approach only proved its importance. He spent months studying topographic maps, measuring distances, identifying water sources, and potential hiding places. He drove the long stretches of highway near the base's perimeter, stopping at overlooks to glass the distant facilities through binoculars. He timed security patrols, noted when helicopter flights were most frequent, and learned the rhythm of the base's activity. Freeman's preparation was methodical, drawing on skills learned from years of survey work and desert exploration. He knew how to navigate by stars when GPS failed, how to find water in seemingly barren terrain, and how to move through hostile territory without leaving tracks. Most importantly, he knew how to be patient, to wait and watch and listen until the landscape revealed its secrets. As 1997 approached, Freeman felt ready. He had identified what he believed was a feasible route into the restricted zone, planned for a week-long observation period, and prepared equipment that would allow him to document whatever he might find. In his mind, he wasn't planning to break the law. He was planning to conduct the most important archaeological expedition of his lifetime. Chapter 2: The Approach. Memorial Day weekend of 1997 promised to be one of the quietest times of the year around Area 51. Freeman had observed that holiday weekends typically brought reduced activity to the base, with fewer test flights and lighter security patrols. It was a calculated gamble based on months of watching the facility's rhythms from legal vantage points along Highway 375. Freeman had chosen his approach route with the same methodical care he applied to mapping ancient settlements. The Nevada test site sprawled across more than 1,300 square miles of desert, much of it unpatrolled except by occasional helicopter sweeps. While the core facilities around Groom Lake were heavily monitored, the outer boundaries were vast and porous. Freeman believed he had found a gap. His route would take him through Yucca Wash, a natural drainage that cut through the mountains north of the restricted zone. The wash was deep enough to provide cover from ground observation and twisted enough to break up any straight sightlines that might reveal movement to distant watchers. Most importantly, it was far from the main roads where security teams focused their attention. Freeman had cached supplies along his intended path during 3 separate scouting trips over the previous 2 months. Small stores of water and energy bars hidden beneath rock cairns that looked natural but were positioned precisely where he would need them. He had learned this technique from studying how ancient peoples had survived in the desert, establishing supply points along trade routes that could sustain travelers across vast empty spaces. On the Friday morning of Memorial Day weekend, Freeman loaded his small pickup truck with what appeared to be standard camping gear. A worn sleeping bag, a lightweight tent, and a day pack that seemed sized for casual hiking. Hidden within the innocent-looking equipment were items that revealed the true nature of his mission. A military surplus ghillie suit broken down into component parts that could be reassembled into desert camouflage. Compact binoculars with night vision capability. A small digital camera with a telephoto lens. Freeman's clothing had been chosen with the same attention to detail. Earth-toned fabrics in browns and greys that would blend with the desert landscape. Soft-soled boots that would leave minimal tracks in sandy soil. A wide-brimmed hat that would break up the distinctive outline of a human head when viewed from a distance. He had even practiced moving in the outfit, learning how the fabric rustled and which movements created the least visible disturbance. The drive to his starting point took 3 hours through increasingly empty country. Freeman followed Highway 95 north from Las Vegas, then turned east on unmarked dirt roads that grew progressively rougher. He passed the occasional mining claim marker and the rusted remnants of old prospecting camps, reminders that people had been seeking hidden treasures in this desert for more than a century. Freeman parked his truck at what appeared to be an abandoned mining access road, the kind of dead-end track that might attract a weekend rockhound or casual explorer. He had scouted this location specifically because satellite images showed it was far enough from known patrol routes to avoid casual detection, but close enough to his planned entry point to make the approach feasible on foot. The transformation from suburban surveyor to desert infiltrator took place in the pre-dawn darkness beside his truck. Freeman assembled his camouflage clothing piece by piece, checking each item against a mental checklist developed through months of preparation. The ghillie suit went on last, its carefully attached vegetation making him appear as just another desert shrub when motionless. Freeman's pack contained exactly what he calculated he would need for 7 days of observation. Water for 3 days with knowledge of where to find more from his cached supplies. High-energy food that would sustain him without requiring cooking fires that might betray his position. A small sleeping system designed to provide warmth without the bulk of traditional camping gear. The first mile of his approach followed a game trail that wound through sage brush and desert grass. Freeman moved slowly, pausing frequently to listen for the sound of vehicles or aircraft. The desert at dawn was alive with small sounds, the rustle of kangaroo rats, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through dry vegetation. He learned to distinguish these natural sounds from anything that might signal human presence. As the sun climbed higher, Freeman entered the rougher terrain of Yucca Wash. Here, his pace slowed even further as he picked his way between boulders and around deadfall from flash floods. The wash bottom was sandy in places, rocky in others, but always provided the cover he needed to move undetected toward his objective. Freeman had studied the security measures around Area 51 as carefully as he had once studied the defensive positions of ancient settlements. He knew about the motion sensors placed along obvious approach routes, the seismic detectors that could register footsteps on hard ground, and the network of cameras that monitored key choke points. His route had been planned to avoid all known sensor locations, while taking advantage of natural terrain features that would mask his approach. By midday, Freeman had covered nearly half the distance to his planned observation point. He rested in the shade of an overhanging rock, sipping water sparingly and listening to the vast silence of the desert. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next range of hills, lay one of the most secret facilities on Earth. In a few hours, if everything went according to plan, he would cross an invisible line that separated the public world from a realm of classified projects and hidden technology. Freeman's heart rate had been elevated all morning, not from physical exertion, but from the growing realization that he was about to attempt something that no civilian had ever claimed to accomplish and survive to tell about. He was approaching the most restricted airspace in America, protected by sensors, patrols, and the full weight of federal law enforcement. But in Freeman's mind, he was simply doing what archaeologists had always done. He was seeking evidence, looking for traces of a story that others preferred to keep buried. Whether that story involved advanced human technology or something far more extraordinary, he believed it deserved to be told. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Freeman resumed his careful advance toward the heart of the mystery. Chapter 3: Crossing the Line. The first warning sign appeared exactly where Freeman's research had predicted it would. A weathered metal placard mounted on a steel post, its red lettering faded but still legible in the late afternoon Sunday. Restricted area. It is unlawful to enter this area without permission of the installation commander. Section 21, Internal Security Act, 1950. While on this installation, all personnel and the property under their control are subject to search, use of deadly force authorized. Freeman crouched behind a cluster of barrel cacti, studying the sign through his binoculars. Beyond it, the desert looked exactly the same as the terrain he had been crossing for hours. The same pale soil, the same scattered sagebrush, the same distant mountains shimmering in the heat. Yet this invisible line represented one of the most heavily defended boundaries in the world. According to Freeman's account, he spent nearly an hour observing the area around the warning signs. He was looking for the sensors he knew must be there. Motion detectors hidden among the rocks, seismic monitors buried beneath the sandy soil, perhaps even more exotic detection systems that could register body heat or electromagnetic signatures from electronic devices. The official perimeter of Area 51 had been moved several times over the decades, expanding outward each time public interest in the base grew too intense. Freeman had studied declassified maps showing the original boundaries from the 1950s, when the base was smaller and the restricted zone extended only a few miles in each direction. By the 1990s, the buffer zone had grown to encompass hundreds of square miles of seemingly empty desert. Freeman claimed he identified 3 sensor clusters during his observation period, small rectangular boxes mounted on posts that were painted to blend with the desert landscape. Underground cables running between detection points, visible only as slight depressions in the soil where the earth had settled over buried conduits. And most concerning, what appeared to be a passive radar installation disguised as a weather monitoring station on a distant hilltop. The route Freeman chose to cross the perimeter took advantage of what he believed was a gap in the sensor network, a narrow wash that ran between two detection clusters, deep enough to shield movement from ground-level sensors, but not so obvious as to attract special attention from security planners. It was the kind of oversight that might exist in any defensive system, a small blind spot created by terrain features and the practical limitations of sensor placement. Freeman's crossing, according to his later account, took place just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. The fading light would make visual detection more difficult, while the cooling air would reduce the effectiveness of thermal sensors. He moved in short bursts, covering 20 or 30 yards at a time before freezing in place to listen for any signs that his presence had been detected. The moment Freeman claimed he crossed into restricted airspace was marked not by any dramatic change in the landscape, but by a profound psychological shift. The same desert that had seemed vast and empty now felt watched, monitored, alive with invisible eyes and electronic senses. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of his clothing against dry brush, the soft crunch of his boots on gravel, even his own breathing seemed loud enough to betray his position. From his new position inside the restricted zone, Freeman had his first clear view of Area 51 itself. The base appeared as a cluster of buildings and hangars in the distance, perhaps 10 miles away across the flat expanse of Groom Lake. Even at that distance, he could make out the distinctive shape of aircraft hangars, the geometric lines of runways, and the scattered dots of vehicles moving between facilities. Freeman described the mixture of fear and exhilaration that overwhelmed him as he realized what he had accomplished. For the first time in decades, perhaps since the base's establishment, a civilian had breached the perimeter of America's most secret facility and lived to observe it. The weight of that achievement was both thrilling and terrifying. Through his binoculars, Freeman began cataloguing the security measures he could observe around the base's outer edge. Mobile patrols that followed dirt roads in regular patterns, their headlights visible as moving points of light in the gathering darkness. Fixed observation posts on hillsides that commanded long views across the desert floor, and overhead, the occasional helicopter making slow circuits around the facility's perimeter. The most striking thing about Area 51 from Freeman's hidden vantage point was how ordinary it appeared. The buildings were standard military construction, the vehicles were conventional trucks and jeeps, the personnel moved with the unhurried efficiency of any routine military operation. If exotic technology was hidden here, it was concealed beneath a facade of bureaucratic normalcy. Freeman established his first observation post among a jumble of boulders that had tumbled from a nearby ridge. The rocks provided both concealment and a stable platform for extended surveillance. He arranged his gear carefully, ensuring that nothing would reflect light or create unnatural shapes that might be detected from a distance. His small cache of water and food was hidden beneath loose stones, positioned where it could be reached without exposing his position. As full darkness settled over the desert, Freeman began to see Area 51 come alive in ways that weren't visible during daylight hours. Lights appeared in buildings that had seemed empty from a distance. Vehicle movements increased along the base's internal road network, and most intriguingly, hangars that had appeared closed and inactive began showing signs of activity as their massive doors slowly opened to reveal glimpses of shadowed interiors. The night brought new challenges for Freeman's surveillance mission. Temperatures dropped quickly in the desert air, requiring him to use his sleeping bag for warmth while maintaining his observation post. The darkness made detailed observation more difficult, but it also provided better concealment for his own position. He could use his night vision equipment without fear of reflected light betraying his location. Freeman's most detailed observations during his first night inside the restricted zone focused on the base's flight operations. He watched aircraft take off and land on runways that appeared longer than anything needed for conventional military jets. Some flights followed standard patterns, rising into the night sky with the familiar sound of jet engines. Others, according to Freeman, were different. Silent shapes that seemed to float rather than fly, moving with the smooth deliberation of something not bound by normal aerodynamic constraints. By dawn of his first full day inside Area 51, Freeman had documented what he believed were clear patterns in the base's operations, regular security patrols that followed predictable routes and timing, shift changes that occurred at 6-hour intervals, creating brief windows when surveillance might be reduced, and underground activity suggested by the movement of personnel into buildings that seemed too small to accommodate the number of people entering them. Freeman's position among the rocks had proven ideal for long-term observation, but it also revealed the magnitude of the challenge he faced. Area 51 was vast. Its most sensitive operations were undoubtedly hidden from view, and his ability to document anything truly significant would depend on patience, luck, and the hope that 7 days would be enough to witness whatever secrets the base might hold. As the sun climbed higher on his first morning, inside the world's most restricted military facility, Freeman settled in for what he hoped would be the most important week of his life. Chapter 4: The Hidden Cache. By mid-morning of his first day inside the restricted zone, Freeman realized his initial observation post among the scattered boulders would not sustain him for a week-long surveillance mission. The rocks provided excellent concealment, but little protection from the desert's extremes. The Nevada sun was already becoming punishing, and he knew the nights would bring bitter cold that could sap his strength and compromise his mission. Freeman's salvation came in the form of a discovery that seemed almost too fortunate to be real. While scouting for a more permanent hide site, he stumbled upon the remnants of what appeared to be an old mining operation. Half hidden in a fold of terrain that couldn't be seen from the main base, the site consisted of a partially collapsed stone shelter and the rusted remains of mining equipment that hadn't been touched in decades. According to Freeman's later account, the shelter dated to the 1950s, part of the uranium boom that had brought prospectors throughout Nevada in the years following World War II. The structure had been built into the side of a low ridge, using the natural rock face as one wall and fitted stones for the others. Time and weather had caused part of the roof to cave in, but enough remained intact to provide crucial shelter from both the elements and prying eyes. The mining cache, as Freeman came to think of it, was invisible from most directions. The entrance faced away from Area 51, hidden by an overhang of rock that cast deep shadows even during midday. Someone could walk within 50 feet of the shelter and never notice it unless they knew exactly where to look. For a man trying to remain undetected in one of the most surveilled places on Earth, it was perfect. Freeman spent the rest of his first day carefully preparing the shelter for extended occupation. He cleared debris from the interior, creating a space just large enough for his sleeping bag and essential gear. Loose stones were repositioned to provide better concealment while allowing airflow to prevent the buildup of body heat that might be detected by thermal sensors. Most importantly, he established sightlines that would allow him to observe the base while remaining completely hidden. The water situation, critical in any desert survival scenario, had been solved weeks earlier during Freeman's preparation phase. He had cached supplies at 3 different locations during his scouting trips, burying plastic bottles wrapped in reflective material to keep them cool. The nearest cache was less than a quarter-mile from his new shelter, accessible through a network of washes that provided concealed movement routes. Freeman's food supply consisted entirely of high-energy bars and dried fruit that could be consumed without cooking or preparation. Nothing that would create smoke, require water, or produce waste that might betray his presence. He had calculated his caloric needs carefully, planning for minimal physical activity during daylight hours, when movement would be most dangerous. His archaeological background had taught him how ancient peoples survived in harsh environments with limited resources. The psychological challenges of his situation became apparent almost immediately. Remaining motionless for hours at a time while maintaining constant vigilance required a mental discipline Freeman had never fully appreciated. During his archaeological work, he could move freely, take breaks, engage in conversation with team members. Here, in the shadow of America's most secret base, any sound or movement could trigger detection systems that would end his mission instantly. Freeman developed a routine that helped him cope with the isolation and stress. His observation periods were broken into 2-hour blocks, each focused on a different aspect of the base's operations. Morning sessions concentrated on shift changes and routine maintenance activities. Afternoon surveillance tracked vehicle movements and aerial operations. Evening watches were reserved for the most sensitive observations, when reduced lighting might reveal activities normally hidden from view. The shelter's position provided an excellent view of Area 51's southern approaches, where much of the base's logistical traffic seemed to flow. Freeman could observe convoys arriving from Las Vegas, carrying everything from routine supplies to cargo that traveled under heavy security escort. Some vehicles followed predictable patterns, arriving at the same times on regular schedules. Others appeared without warning, often under cover of darkness, suggesting deliveries that couldn't be planned far in advance. Freeman's most detailed observations during his early days in the shelter focused on the base's security procedures. He documented guard rotations, patrol patterns, and the sophisticated sensor networks that protected different areas of the facility. What struck him most was the layered nature of the security. The perimeter he had crossed was just the outermost ring. Inside, additional barriers and checkpoints controlled access to progressively more sensitive areas. The nights brought different challenges and opportunities. Temperatures in the desert could drop 40 degrees after sunset, turning Freeman's shelter from an oven into a refrigerator. His sleeping bag was rated for cold weather, but staying warm while remaining alert enough to continue surveillance required careful management of his body heat and energy reserves. The darkness also brought increased activity on the base, with operations that seemed deliberately scheduled to avoid daylight observation. Freeman's most intriguing early observation involved underground access points scattered around the base's periphery. During his second night in the shelter, he watched vehicles disappear into what appeared to be hillsides, following roads that seemed to end abruptly at natural rock faces. The implications were obvious. If Area 51 had extensive underground facilities, then everything visible on the surface might be just a fraction of the actual installation. The isolation began to affect Freeman's mental state in ways he hadn't anticipated. Without human contact or normal sensory stimulation, his mind started playing tricks on him. Distant sounds became threatening. Shadows took on significance they didn't deserve. The constant hypervigilance required to avoid detection was exhausting in ways that physical labor never had been. Freeman found himself talking quietly to himself, maintaining a whispered commentary on his observations to stave off the creeping paranoia that came with extended solitude. By his third day in the shelter, Freeman had established what he believed was an effective surveillance routine. His position allowed him to monitor approximately 60% of the base's visible activities, while remaining completely concealed from ground observation and most aerial surveillance. The shelter's microclimate kept him comfortable enough to maintain his strength, and his cached water supplies were proving adequate for extended operations. Freeman's notes from this period, according to his later accounts, focused heavily on the base's apparent dual nature. Surface operations seemed to involve conventional military aircraft and standard administrative functions. But the underground access points, the heavily secured convoys, and the nighttime activities that avoided normal observation suggested a parallel world of operations that remained hidden even from routine base personnel. The mining shelter had become more than just Freeman's hiding place. It was his observatory, his fortress, and his lifeline in an environment where discovery would mean arrest, prosecution, and the permanent end of his amateur archaeological career. From its shadowed interior, he prepared to document what he hoped would be the most extraordinary discoveries of his lifetime. As Freeman settled into his fourth day of surveillance, the routine of his hidden existence was about to be broken by observations that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the facility he was watching. Chapter 5: Night Movements. On Freeman's fourth night inside the restricted zone, the familiar rhythm of base operations shifted into something entirely different. The change began subtly, with an increase in vehicle traffic along roads that had been nearly empty during his previous observations. Security patrols doubled their frequency, and additional checkpoints appeared at access points that had previously seemed routine. According to Freeman's account, this heightened activity suggested something significant was about to occur. His archaeological instincts, honed through years of recognizing patterns in ancient settlements, told him that the base was preparing for operations that went beyond normal testing schedules. The question was whether he could position himself to observe whatever was about to unfold. Freeman's shelter provided excellent long-range surveillance, but the increased security made it clear that the most important activities would likely occur in areas blocked from his current vantage point. If he wanted to document something truly significant, he would need to move closer to the base's core facilities. It was a calculated risk that could end his mission instantly if he made even the smallest error. The route Freeman chose for his night reconnaissance took advantage of a network of drainage culverts and dry washes that carried runoff from the surrounding mountains during the rare desert storms. These channels, carved by decades of flash floods, provided natural corridors that remained hidden from ground-level observation, while offering concealed approaches to within a few hundred yards of the main hangars. Freeman's movement through these natural tunnels required a combination of patience and physical endurance that tested every skill he had developed during years of desert exploration. The culverts were cramped, forcing him to crawl on hands and knees for hundreds of yards at a time. Sharp rocks tore at his clothing and skin. The confined spaces amplified every sound, making the rustle of fabric or the scrape of equipment against stone seem dangerously loud. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Freeman would advance 20 or 30 feet, then freeze in position to listen for any indication that his movement had been detected. The concrete culverts that channeled water beneath access roads were particularly treacherous, as they funneled sound and created potential choke points where discovery would be unavoidable. As Freeman worked his way closer to the base's operational heart, the desert's natural sounds were gradually replaced by something far more mysterious. At first, he attributed the low-frequency humming to electrical transformers or generators. Every military facility had power systems that created background noise. But this sound was different, seeming to emanate from beneath the ground rather than from visible structures. The humming was constant but varied in intensity, sometimes barely perceptible, other times strong enough to create a physical sensation in Freeman's chest. According to his later accounts, the sound had an almost musical quality, with harmonics and overtones that suggested a level of sophistication beyond simple machinery. Most disturbing, prolonged exposure to the sound created an uncomfortable resonance in his teeth and jawbone that made concentration difficult. Freeman's closest approach to the main hangar complex brought him within 300 yards of structures that appeared conventional from a distance, but revealed unusual features when observed up close. The hangar doors were larger than anything needed for known aircraft, built with reinforcement that suggested they were designed to contain rather than simply shelter whatever was kept inside. Multiple layers of security surrounded each building, with motion sensors, thermal cameras, and what appeared to be more exotic detection systems that Freeman couldn't identify. The mechanical noises that accompanied the base's night operations defied Freeman's attempts at classification. His background in surveying had familiarized him with the sounds of heavy construction equipment, aircraft engines, and industrial machinery. But the sounds emerging from Area 51's hangars matched none of these categories. Some were high-pitched whines that seemed to Doppler shift despite coming from stationary sources. Others were deep thrums that felt more like vibrations than audible sounds. Most puzzling were the intermittent sequences of what Freeman described as almost musical tones. These sounds came in patterns that suggested purpose rather than random mechanical noise. They reminded him of sonar pings or radar sweeps, but with a complexity and beauty that seemed inconsistent with purely functional technology. The tones would build to crescendos that made his teeth ache, then fade to silence before beginning again with slight variations. Freeman's position in the drainage system allowed him to observe personnel movements that were invisible from his distant shelter. Workers in specialized protective suits moved between buildings with equipment that didn't match anything in Freeman's experience. The suits themselves were unusual, sleeker than normal hazmat gear, but clearly designed for protection against something more exotic than chemical contamination. The underground vibrations that Freeman felt through the concrete walls of his hiding place suggested extensive subterranean activity. The base's visible structures were clearly just the surface layer of a much larger complex. Freeman could feel machinery operating deep beneath the desert floor, massive systems that generated the persistent humming and occasional jarring impacts that shook the ground. As the night progressed, Freeman witnessed what he later described as the most extraordinary part of his entire infiltration. Personnel began emerging from underground access points that he hadn't noticed during daylight observations. These entrances were camouflaged so effectively that they seemed to be part of the natural landscape until they opened to reveal hidden elevators and stairways descending into the earth. The individuals using these underground entrances moved with a purpose and urgency that differed from the routine activities Freeman had observed during previous nights. They carried equipment cases and instruments that were handled with extreme care, suggesting contents that were either extremely valuable or potentially dangerous. The protective protocols surrounding these materials implied something far beyond conventional military technology. Freeman's most unsettling observation came near dawn, as the night's activities were winding down. The sounds that had provided a constant background throughout his reconnaissance began to change, building to a climax that made the concrete around him vibrate sympathetically. The musical tones reached frequencies that were barely audible but seemed to penetrate every cell in his body. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The humming ceased, the mechanical noises faded, and the desert returned to its natural silence. The sudden quiet was almost more disturbing than the sounds themselves, leaving Freeman with the impression that he had witnessed only a brief glimpse of activities that continued constantly beneath the surface. Freeman's retreat to his shelter required the same painstaking care as his approach, but his mind was no longer focused on the physical challenges of movement through the culverts. The sounds he had heard, the underground activity he had observed, and the sophisticated equipment he had witnessed suggested that Area 51 housed technology that operated on principles he couldn't begin to understand. As Freeman reached the safety of his hidden cache, the desert dawn was beginning to paint the eastern mountains in shades of gold and red. He had gathered intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain from any legal vantage point. But the information raised more questions than it answered, and Freeman realized that his most important discoveries might still lie ahead. The sounds that had made his teeth ache would echo in his memory for years to come, a reminder that beneath the ordinary appearance of Area 51 lay mysteries that challenged the boundaries of known science. Chapter 6. The Disk in Hangar 18. Freeman's fifth dawn inside the restricted zone began like the others, with the gradual lightening of the eastern sky and the return of normal desert sounds after a night of mysterious mechanical activity. But as he settled into his morning observation routine from the concealed mining shelter, something unprecedented was about to unfold before his eyes. According to Freeman's later testimony, the unusual activity began around 4:30 in the morning, during the quiet period when the night shift was preparing to hand operations over to the day crew. This transition time had previously been marked by reduced activity and minimal vehicle movement. But on this particular morning, Freeman noticed an increase in security patrols around what appeared to be Hangar 18, a massive structure on the base's southern edge. Hangar 18 had drawn Freeman's attention during his previous observations because of its unusual dimensions. The building was significantly larger than the other aircraft shelters on the base, with doors that seemed oversized even for the largest military transports. More intriguingly, the hangar showed minimal daytime activity despite its prominent position and substantial size, suggesting that whatever it contained was moved only under carefully controlled conditions. Through his binoculars, Freeman watched as security teams established a perimeter around Hangar 18 that extended far beyond the normal protocols he had observed for other buildings. Personnel in protective gear began positioning what appeared to be sophisticated monitoring equipment at regular intervals around the structure. The level of preparation suggested that something extraordinary was about to be moved. Freeman's archaeological training had taught him to recognize the signs of significant excavation or artifact movement. The careful preparation, the specialized equipment, and the heightened security all indicated that whatever was about to emerge from Hangar 18 was considered extremely valuable and potentially fragile. His pulse quickened as he realized he might be about to witness something that would validate years of speculation about Area 51. The hangar doors began opening just as the first light of dawn touched the eastern mountains. The massive panels moved slowly, revealing glimpses of the shadowed interior. Freeman adjusted his binoculars and held his breath, knowing that the next few minutes might provide the evidence that hundreds of researchers had sought for decades. What emerged from Hangar 18 defied Freeman's ability to categorize it within any known aircraft design. The object was disc-shaped, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with a profile that suggested a central dome rising perhaps 8 feet above a flatter peripheral section. But it was the surface of the craft that captured Freeman's attention most completely. The hull appeared to be made of a single piece of material with no visible seams, rivets, or joints of any kind. According to Freeman's detailed account, the craft's surface had an unusual relationship with light that made extended observation both fascinating and difficult. The material seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the surface itself was in constant, subtle motion. Colours played across the hull in patterns that reminded Freeman of oil on water, but with a depth and complexity that suggested the optical effects were inherent to the material rather than surface contamination. The personnel handling the craft moved with extreme care, using equipment that Freeman had never seen in any military or aerospace context. Instead of conventional dollies or transport platforms, the disc rested on what appeared to be a cushion of air or some other invisible support system. Workers approaching the object wore protective suits that were sleeker and more sophisticated than any hazmat gear Freeman recognized, with integrated systems that seemed to monitor both the environment and the wearer's condition. Freeman noted that the workers maintained specific distances from the craft, as if proximity itself posed some kind of risk. Those who needed to approach closely did so only briefly, using tools with extended handles to avoid direct contact. The precautions suggested that the object might be radioactive, electromagnetically active, or dangerous in ways that conventional safety protocols couldn't address. The movement of the disc from Hangar 18 to its destination took nearly 2 hours, despite the relatively short distance involved. The transport proceeded at walking pace, with frequent stops that allowed monitoring teams to check their instruments and ensure that all parameters remained within acceptable ranges. Freeman observed multiple teams working in coordination, each apparently responsible for different aspects of the operation. The most striking aspect of the transport, according to Freeman, was the complete absence of mechanical noise from the craft itself. Conventional aircraft, even when powered down, create sounds when moved. Metal flexes, systems settle, and surfaces respond to changes in temperature and pressure. But the disc being moved across Area 51 made no sound whatsoever, moving in what Freeman described as an almost ethereal silence. The destination for the disc appeared to be a smaller hangar that Freeman had previously assumed was used for storage or maintenance. But as the transport convoy approached, he realized that the building's ordinary exterior concealed a much more sophisticated interior. The doors that opened to receive the craft were lined with what appeared to be specialized ceiling systems, and the interior was illuminated by lighting that seemed unusually bright and uniform. Freeman's position allowed him to observe the careful choreography involved in moving the disc into its new location. The process required nearly an hour of precise maneuvering, with personnel using hand signals and electronic communications to coordinate movements that had to be accurate to within inches. The level of precision suggested that the craft's final position was critical, perhaps for connection to specific support systems or monitoring equipment. As the morning progressed and normal base operations resumed, Freeman found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed. His archaeological background had prepared him to analyze artifacts and structures, but the disk he had observed seemed to operate according to principles that challenged basic assumptions about materials, science, and engineering. The seamless construction, the unusual optical properties, and the extraordinary care taken in its handling all suggested technology that was decades or perhaps centuries ahead of anything publicly known. The protective protocols surrounding the disk also raised questions that Freeman couldn't answer. The specialized equipment, the maintained distances, and the sophisticated monitoring all indicated that the object posed risks that conventional safety measures couldn't address. Whether these risks were related to radiation, electromagnetic fields, or something even more exotic remained unclear. Freeman's observations of the personnel involved in the transport revealed another puzzling aspect of the operation. The workers moved with the confidence and efficiency of people performing a familiar routine, suggesting that such operations were conducted regularly rather than representing a unique event. If Freeman's interpretation was correct, then the movement of exotic craft was a normal part of Area 51's activities, hidden from public view by the base's extraordinary security measures. As the disk disappeared into its new hangar and the security perimeter was dismantled, Freeman realized that he had documented something that would be nearly impossible to verify or replicate. Without photographs or physical evidence, his testimony would be dismissed by skeptics as hallucination or fabrication. Yet the experience had been so vivid and detailed that Freeman knew he would remember every aspect for the rest of his life. The sight of that shimmering, seamless disk would haunt Freeman's dreams and validate his deepest convictions about Area 51's true purpose. Whether the craft was of human or extraterrestrial origin, it represented technology that remained far beyond public knowledge or understanding. Chapter 7: Underground Activity. After witnessing the movement of the disk from Hangar 18, Freeman's perspective on Area 51 underwent a fundamental shift. What he had initially viewed as a surface facility with possible underground storage areas now seemed more like the visible tip of a vast subterranean complex. The building that had received the disk was too small to house such a significant object permanently, suggesting that it served as merely an access point to deeper levels carved into the Nevada bedrock. Freeman's observations during his 6th day inside the restricted zone focused on documenting the patterns of personnel movement that suggested extensive underground operations. From his concealed position in the mining shelter, he began maintaining careful counts of individuals entering and leaving various buildings. The discrepancies were striking and consistent. Far more people entered certain structures than ever emerged, at least not through the same entrances. According to Freeman's detailed notes, Building 7 appeared to be the most active underground access point. The structure itself was unremarkable, a standard concrete block construction that might house offices or storage areas at any military facility. But Freeman's patient observation revealed that an average of 40 to 50 personnel entered the building during each 8-hour shift, while only 15 to 20 individuals used the same entrance to leave. The implications were obvious to Freeman's methodical mind. Either people were accumulating inside a building that couldn't possibly accommodate such numbers, or they were accessing lower levels through concealed elevators, stairways, or other transport systems. The mathematical certainty of this conclusion was reinforced by similar patterns observed at 3 other buildings scattered around the base's perimeter. Freeman's archaeological background had familiarized him with the techniques used to hide entrances to underground chambers. Ancient peoples had often concealed access points to storage areas, ceremonial spaces, or defensive positions by disguising them within ordinary structures. The same principles could easily be applied to modern military construction, creating buildings that appeared routine from the outside while serving as gateways to hidden facilities. The most compelling evidence for extensive underground activity came through Freeman's physical senses rather than visual observation. Beginning on his fourth night inside the restricted zone, he had noticed subtle vibrations transmitted through the ground beneath his shelter. At first, he attributed these sensations to heavy vehicles or aircraft operations on the surface. But careful correlation with visible activities revealed that the vibrations often occurred when the base appeared quiet and inactive. Freeman described the underground vibrations as coming in distinct patterns that suggested different types of machinery or operations. Some were steady, rhythmic pulses that reminded him of large pumps or ventilation systems. Others were intermittent impacts, as if massive objects were being moved or positioned in chambers far below the desert floor. Most intriguing were the high-frequency tremors that seemed to travel through the bedrock itself, carrying information about activities that might be occurring miles away from his observation point. The intensity of these vibrations varied throughout the day and night, but Freeman noted that the strongest periods coincided with times when surface activity was minimal. This inverse relationship suggested that the most sensitive underground operations were deliberately scheduled to avoid detection by surface observers or monitoring systems. If Freeman's interpretation was correct, then the visible activities at Area 51 served partly as camouflage for far more significant work being conducted in hidden chambers. Freeman's theory about the base's true scope was reinforced by his observations of the facility's power and communication systems. The electrical infrastructure visible from his position seemed oversized for the surface operations he could observe. Power lines carried far more capacity than would be needed for the hangars, administrative buildings, and support facilities that comprised the visible base. Similarly, the communication arrays and satellite dishes suggested data transmission requirements that exceeded anything a conventional aircraft testing facility would require. The waste heat signatures Freeman observed through his night vision equipment provided additional evidence for extensive underground operations. Even during periods when surface activities were minimal, thermal vents and cooling systems continued operating at high capacity. The heat patterns suggested climate-controlled environments that operated continuously, regardless of weather conditions or surface activities. Such systems would be necessary for maintaining sensitive equipment or materials in underground laboratories or storage facilities. Freeman's most detailed observations of underground access procedures occurred during shift changes, when the movement of personnel was most concentrated and visible. He watched teams of workers approach buildings that served as access points, pass through security checkpoints that seemed unusually thorough for routine facilities, and disappear into structures for hours at a time. The security protocols included biometric scanning, metal detectors, and what appeared to be specialized screening for electromagnetic or radiological contamination. The specialized equipment carried by personnel entering underground areas differed significantly from anything Freeman had observed in surface operations. Workers transported sealed containers that were handled with extreme care, instruments that were shielded against electromagnetic interference, and personal protective equipment that seemed designed for environments more exotic than conventional laboratories or workshops. The level of precaution suggested that underground activities involved materials or processes that posed unusual risks. Freeman's calculations, based on the volume of personnel and equipment entering underground access points, led him to estimate that the hidden portions of Area 51 might be 3 to 5 times larger than the visible surface facilities. If his estimates were accurate, then hundreds of people were working in chambers and corridors that had been excavated from the solid rock beneath the Nevada desert. Such a construction project would have required years of work and resources that dwarfed most military installations. The logistics of maintaining such an extensive underground complex raised questions that Freeman couldn't fully answer from his limited observation post. The transportation of materials, the disposal of excavated rock, and the installation of life support systems would have required operations that somehow escaped public detection, despite occurring in one of the most monitored regions of the United States. Either the construction had taken place decades earlier, when satellite surveillance was less sophisticated, or it continued using methods that remained invisible to conventional detection. Freeman's growing conviction that Area 51 was primarily an underground facility fundamentally changed his understanding of what he was observing. The hangars, runways, and administrative buildings that comprised the visible base were not the main installation, but rather the infrastructure needed to support activities conducted in hidden chambers below. The disk he had witnessed being moved between hangars might have been transported to an underground facility for more detailed study or long-term storage. The implications of such an extensive hidden installation were staggering. If Area 51 truly contained miles of underground chambers, then the facility could house research projects, storage areas, and operational centers that would never be detected by satellite reconnaissance or aerial observation. Technology that was decades or centuries ahead of public knowledge could be developed and tested in complete secrecy, emerging only when security requirements allowed limited surface operations. As Freeman prepared for what he hoped would be his most important night of observation, the steady vibrations beneath his shelter reminded him that the true heart of Area 51 lay not in the buildings he could see, but in the hidden world carved into the rock beneath his feet. Chapter 8: The Beings. Freeman's most controversial claim emerged from his observations during the pre-dawn hours of his 6th day inside the restricted zone. According to his later testimony, what he witnessed challenged not only his understanding of Area 51's purpose, but his fundamental assumptions about who or what might be housed within the facility's hidden chambers. The incident began around 3:30 in the morning, during what Freeman had come to recognize as the base's most sensitive operational period. Surface activity was minimal, security patrols had settled into predictable patterns, and the strange underground vibrations that characterized nighttime operations were building toward their usual intensity. Freeman was conducting routine surveillance from his concealed position when movement near Building 7 caught his attention. At first, Freeman assumed he was observing another personnel transfer between surface and underground facilities. The security protocols were familiar: armed escorts, electronic screening, and the careful coordination that characterized all sensitive operations at the base. But as Freeman focused his night vision equipment on the activity, he realized that something about this particular movement was fundamentally different from anything he had previously observed. According to Freeman's detailed account, the figures being escorted between buildings did not match the proportions or movement patterns of normal base personnel. They were significantly smaller than the human escorts, appearing to stand no more than 4 feet in height. Their build was unusually thin, with limbs that seemed elongated relative to their torso size. Most disturbing to Freeman was their method of locomotion, which suggested difficulty adapting to Earth's gravitational environment. Freeman described the beings as moving with a deliberate, almost floating gait that reminded him of astronauts learning to walk in reduced gravity environments. Their steps seemed too light for beings of even their small stature, and they appeared to require conscious effort to maintain contact with the ground. The escorts moved at a pace that accommodated this unusual mobility, suggesting that such transfers were routine enough that protocols had been developed to ensure safe movement. The most striking aspect of Freeman's observation was his description of the being's appearance under the artificial lighting that illuminated the transfer route. According to his account, their skin had an almost translucent quality that seemed to diffuse light rather than simply reflecting it. The effect was subtle but distinct, creating an appearance that Freeman struggled to categorize within his experience of normal human physiology. Freeman's attempts to observe more details were frustrated by the careful positioning of the escort team, which maintained formations that blocked clear sight lines to the beings being protected. The security procedures suggested that even within the heavily restricted environment of Area 51, these particular individuals required additional protection from observation. Whether this protection was for their benefit or to prevent unauthorized personnel from witnessing their presence remained unclear. The clothing worn by the beings was as unusual as their physical characteristics. Freeman described garments that appeared to be single-piece construction, with no visible seams, fasteners, or conventional tailoring details. The material seemed to change its reflective properties depending on the viewing angle, sometimes appearing almost metallic, other times seeming to absorb light completely. The effect reminded Freeman of the surface characteristics he had observed on the disc that had been moved between hangars. Freeman's psychological response to this observation was perhaps as significant as the physical details he documented. His archaeological training had prepared him to analyze unfamiliar artifacts and structures, but witnessing what appeared to be non-human entities challenged his ability to maintain objective documentation. The immediate question was whether he was observing something genuinely extraordinary or whether isolation and stress had begun affecting his perception of normal events. The fear of discovery added another layer of complexity to Freeman's situation. His desire to observe more details conflicted with the knowledge that any movement or sound from his position could trigger detection systems that would end his mission instantly. The beings and their escorts were operating within a few hundred yards of his hiding place, close enough that enhanced security measures might detect even the smallest disturbance. Freeman's account describes struggling with the urge to use his camera to document what he was witnessing. The potential value of photographic evidence was obvious, but the risks were equally clear. The flash or mechanical sounds of the camera could betray his position, and even if he succeeded in taking photographs, the low light conditions and distance might produce images too unclear to serve as convincing documentation. The transfer operation lasted approximately 20 minutes, during which Freeman observed what appeared to be 3 separate beings being moved from one underground access point to another. Each movement followed identical security protocols, suggesting that such operations were conducted according to well-established procedures rather than representing emergency or improvised activities. Freeman noted that the human personnel involved in the escort maintained professional demeanor throughout the operation, showing no signs of surprise or unusual concern about the nature of their charges. This suggested to Freeman that interaction with non-human entities was a routine part of operations at Area 51, familiar enough that it no longer generated emotional responses among base personnel. The most troubling aspect of Freeman's observation was his growing conviction that what he was witnessing was real rather than hallucination or misidentification. The consistent physical characteristics of the beings, the elaborate security protocols surrounding their movement, and the matter-of-fact attitude of the human escorts all suggested genuine interaction with entities that were not part of normal base operations. Freeman's attempts to rationalize what he had observed led him through various alternative explanations. Perhaps the beings were human test subjects wearing experimental suits or equipment. Maybe they were animatronic figures being moved between testing facilities, or possibly they represented some form of psychological operations designed to confuse potential observers. But none of these explanations adequately accounted for the subtle details Freeman had observed. The natural movement patterns, the apparent difficulty with Earth gravity, and the sophisticated protective protocols all suggested entities that required accommodation rather than simple transportation. Most convincingly, the casual efficiency of the human escorts implied familiarity with beings whose needs and characteristics had been thoroughly studied. As the transfer operation concluded and normal base operations resumed, Freeman found himself confronting the possibility that Area 51 housed not only advanced technology of unknown origin, but the entities who had created or operated that technology. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the facility served as more than a research installation, but as a point of ongoing contact between human and non-human intelligence. Freeman's remaining time inside the restricted zone would be colored by this observation, transforming his mission from documentation of unusual technology to potential witness of one of the most significant discoveries in human history. Whether his account represented accurate observation or the product of stress-induced hallucination would remain a question that haunted Freeman for the rest of his life. The image of those small, translucent figures moving carefully between hidden chambers would become the centerpiece of Freeman's most controversial claims about his week inside America's most secret facility. Chapter 9. Close Call with Security. Freeman's 7th morning inside the restricted zone began with an ominous change in the base's routine operations. Instead of the predictable shift changes and equipment movements that had characterized previous days, Freeman observed an increase in security patrols and what appeared to be systematic search patterns extending far beyond the normal perimeter checks. According to Freeman's account, the heightened security began around dawn and intensified throughout the morning hours. Vehicles that normally followed established routes were now conducting grid searches of areas that had previously received only occasional attention. Helicopter flights increased in frequency, with aircraft following methodical patterns that suggested they were looking for something specific rather than conducting routine reconnaissance. Freeman's growing unease was compounded by his observation that several patrol teams were equipped with detection equipment he hadn't seen during his previous week of surveillance. Handheld devices that might have been metal detectors, thermal imaging equipment, and what appeared to be more sophisticated sensors suggested that the search was being conducted with technology capable of detecting human presence even in carefully concealed positions. The realization that he might have been discovered created a psychological crisis that Freeman struggled to manage from his confined hiding place. His archaeological training had prepared him for patient observation and careful documentation, but not for the stress of potentially imminent capture by military security forces. The knowledge that discovery would mean arrest, prosecution, and the complete destruction of his reputation made concentration on normal surveillance activities nearly impossible. Freeman's closest encounter with detection occurred around 10:30 in the morning, when a 4-man patrol team approached his position from the direction of the main base. According to his later testimony, the team was moving with the deliberate precision of searchers who had been given specific coordinates rather than conducting a random sweep of the area. The patrol's approach route brought them directly toward the fold in the terrain that concealed Freeman's mining shelter. From his position inside the partially collapsed structure, Freeman could hear the crunch of boots on gravel and the static bursts of radio communications as the team coordinated their search pattern. The sound of their movement grew steadily louder, suggesting an approach that would bring them within direct visual range of his hiding place. Freeman's response to the approaching threat required a level of physical and mental discipline that tested every survival skill he had developed during years of desert exploration. He wrapped himself completely in a camouflaged tarp that had been positioned to blend with the debris inside the shelter, controlled his breathing to minimize any sound that might betray his presence, and remained absolutely motionless despite the cramped conditions and psychological stress. The patrol team's closest approach brought them to within 50 feet of Freeman's position, close enough that he could distinguish individual voices and hear fragments of their radio communications. According to Freeman's account, the searchers were using handheld detection equipment to scan the area systematically, checking behind rock formations and investigating any location that could potentially conceal a human presence. Freeman described the psychological torture of lying motionless while listening to the search team work methodically through the terrain around his shelter. Every sound seemed amplified to dangerous levels. The rustle of the tarp against his clothing, his own heartbeat, and even the involuntary muscular tremors caused by stress and cramped positioning all seemed loud enough to attract attention from the nearby searchers. The most terrifying moment came when one of the patrol members stopped directly outside the shelter entrance and appeared to be examining the partially collapsed structure. Freeman could hear the man moving loose stones and debris, apparently investigating whether the ruins might conceal an intruder. For several minutes that felt like hours, Freeman remained frozen in position while a trained security operative conducted a detailed inspection just feet from his location. Freeman's survival depended on the camouflage techniques he had learned during years of archaeological fieldwork and wildlife observation. The tarp that concealed him had been chosen to match the colors and textures of the mining debris that filled the shelter. His position was carefully arranged to avoid creating any geometric shapes or unnatural shadows that might catch the attention of a searching eye. Most importantly, he had learned to control his breathing and minimize involuntary movements that could betray human presence. The search team's radio communications, fragments of which Freeman could overhear during their closest approach, suggested that they were working from specific intelligence rather than conducting a routine security sweep. References to possible intrusion detection and sensor anomalies indicated that his presence might have been detected by technological means rather than visual observation. Freeman's growing paranoia about detection systems he couldn't understand was reinforced by the search team's equipment and methods. The handheld devices they carried seemed more sophisticated than simple metal detectors, and their search patterns suggested familiarity with advanced surveillance technology. If Area 51 employed seismic sensors, electromagnetic field detectors, or even more exotic monitoring systems, Freeman realized that his presence might have been tracked from the moment he crossed the perimeter. The psychological pressure of potential discovery was compounded by Freeman's physical discomfort after hours of absolute immobility. Muscle cramps, dehydration, and the claustrophobic conditions inside the shelter created a combination of stress factors that threatened his ability to remain motionless and silent. The knowledge that even the smallest movement could trigger capture required a level of self-control that pushed Freeman to his psychological limits. After what Freeman estimated was nearly 3 hours, the search team finally moved away from his immediate area and continued their systematic sweep of the surrounding terrain. But the relief of immediate survival was tempered by the realization that his presence had likely been detected through methods he couldn't identify or counter. The question was whether the searchers had failed to locate him due to superior concealment, or whether they were simply conducting a preliminary investigation before bringing in more sophisticated detection equipment. Freeman's confidence in his ability to remain undetected for the remainder of his planned observation period was severely shaken by the close encounter with the search team. The knowledge that Area 51's security forces were actively looking for an intruder meant that every moment he remained inside the restricted zone increased the risk of capture. His archaeological mission had transformed into a survival situation where discovery would have consequences far beyond professional embarrassment. The search team's withdrawal left Freeman with a critical decision about whether to abort his mission or continue surveillance despite the obvious risks. His position had been compromised, even if not yet discovered, and the heightened security measures suggested that future detection was increasingly likely. Yet the extraordinary observations he had already made seemed to justify the risks involved in completing his planned week-long documentation period. As Freeman settled back into his surveillance routine, the knowledge that trained security operatives had come within feet of his position added a new dimension of stress to every sound and movement around his shelter. The close call had demonstrated both the effectiveness of his concealment techniques and the very real possibility that his next encounter with base security might not end as favorably. Chapter 10: The Test Flight. Freeman's most extraordinary observation occurred during the late afternoon of his 7th day inside the restricted zone, as lengthening shadows began to provide deeper concealment for his position. According to his account, the event that followed would validate every risk he had taken and every hardship he had endured during his week-long infiltration of America's most secret facility. The afternoon had been unusually quiet around Area 51, with minimal vehicle traffic and reduced personnel movement between buildings. Freeman had interpreted this lull as a return to normal operations following the morning's intensive security sweep. But as he maintained his routine surveillance from the mining shelter, subtle changes in the base's activity suggested that something significant was being prepared. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Freeman observed increased activity around the hangars on the base's southern perimeter. Ground crews began clearing areas that had been empty throughout his previous observations, positioning equipment and establishing what appeared to be monitoring stations at carefully measured distances from the main runway complex. The preparations reminded Freeman of the protocols he had witnessed before the disk was moved between hangars, suggesting that another extraordinary operation was about to unfold. Freeman's attention was drawn to Hangar 7, a structure that had shown minimal activity during his week of observation. Unlike the building that had housed the disk, this hangar appeared to be designed for active operations rather than storage. The doors were larger than standard aircraft hangars, and the surrounding infrastructure included power systems and communication arrays that seemed oversized for conventional flight operations. The hangar doors began opening around 5:15, revealing an interior that was too shadowed for Freeman to observe clearly from his distant position. But the careful coordination of ground personnel and the sophisticated monitoring equipment being positioned around the area indicated that whatever was about to emerge required extraordinary precautions. Freeman adjusted his binoculars and prepared his small camera, knowing that he might be about to witness something unprecedented. What emerged from Hangar 7 defied Freeman's ability to categorize it within any known aircraft design. The craft appeared to be triangular in basic configuration, but with curves and angles that seemed to flow together without distinct edges or corners. The surface exhibited the same seamless characteristics Freeman had observed on the disc, appearing to be constructed from a single piece of material with no visible joints, panels, or access ports. According to Freeman's detailed account, the craft's most striking feature was its relationship with gravity and conventional aerodynamics. Instead of taxiing along the runway like a normal aircraft, the object rose vertically from the hangar floor without any visible means of propulsion. There were no jet exhausts, rotor systems, or other mechanical devices that could account for its ability to hover motionless in the air above the base. Freeman described the craft's initial ascent as unnaturally smooth and deliberate, rising at a constant rate that suggested precise control rather than the variable thrust characteristics of conventional aircraft. The absence of sound was perhaps even more remarkable than the silent liftoff. Even at a distance of several miles, Freeman should have been able to hear jet engines, helicopter rotors, or other propulsion systems powerful enough to lift an object of the craft's apparent size. The hovering phase of the flight test provided Freeman with his clearest observation opportunity. For approximately 10 minutes, the craft maintained a stationary position roughly 500 feet above the main runway complex. During this period, Freeman could observe details that reinforced his conviction that he was witnessing technology far beyond anything publicly known. The craft's surface continued to exhibit the optical anomalies Freeman had noted on the disc. Colors seemed to shift across the hull in patterns that suggested the material itself was active rather than simply reflective. Under the late afternoon sun, the effect created an almost hypnotic display that made extended observation both fascinating and disorienting. Freeman's attempts to photograph the hovering craft were frustrated by the same technical limitations that had prevented documentation of his earlier observations. The distance between his position and the test flight area meant that even with his telephoto lens, the craft appeared as little more than a distant speck against the sky. The unusual optical properties of the hull made focusing difficult, and the bright desert lighting created contrast problems that further degraded image quality. The craft's acceleration phase provided the most dramatic aspect of Freeman's observation. According to his account, the object transitioned from stationary hover to supersonic speed without any visible period of acceleration. One moment it was motionless above the runway. The next, it was streaking across the desert sky at a velocity that seemed impossible for any known aircraft. Freeman described the acceleration as instantaneous and silent, with no sonic boom or other atmospheric disturbance that would normally accompany such rapid movement. The craft's trajectory took it almost directly over his position, providing a brief close-range observation opportunity before it disappeared into the eastern sky. Even at close range, Freeman could detect no sound or heat signature from the passing object. The most disturbing aspect of the craft's performance was its apparent disregard for the physical laws that governed conventional flight. The instantaneous acceleration would have subjected any human pilot to gravitational forces far beyond survival limits. The absence of visible propulsion systems suggested energy sources and control mechanisms that operated on principles unknown to public science. Freeman's psychological response to witnessing the test flight was a mixture of vindication and overwhelming awe. His years of speculation about Area 51's true purpose seemed validated by the extraordinary technology he had observed. Yet the implications of such advanced capabilities raised questions that challenged his fundamental understanding of human technological development. The ground crew's response to the test flight provided additional evidence that such operations were routine rather than experimental. Personnel went about their post-flight procedures with the efficiency of teams conducting familiar operations. Equipment was secured, monitoring stations were dismantled, and the area was cleared according to well-established protocols that suggested regular flight testing of similar craft. Freeman's photographs of the test flight, taken with a small digital camera under challenging lighting conditions, would later prove disappointingly inconclusive. The images showed indistinct shapes against the sky that could be interpreted as unusual aircraft or dismissed as photographic artifacts. The distance, atmospheric distortion, and technical limitations of his equipment meant that even Freeman's most important observation could not be definitively verified through visual documentation. As the sun set on Freeman's 7th day inside the restricted zone, the test flight had provided the capstone observation for his unprecedented infiltration mission. Whether the craft represented human technology decades ahead of public knowledge or something of truly extraterrestrial origin, it demonstrated capabilities that redefined the possible scope of Area 51's research programs. The silent acceleration across the desert sky would remain etched in Freeman's memory as proof that his week of hardship and risk had yielded observations that justified every danger he had faced. Whatever the craft's true origin, it represented technology that existed far beyond the boundaries of publicly acknowledged science. Chapter 11. Voices in the Desert. Freeman's decision to bring radio monitoring equipment on his infiltration mission proved to be one of his most valuable preparation choices. The compact scanner, designed for monitoring emergency services and aviation frequencies, had remained silent for most of his week inside the restricted zone. Area 51's communications were presumably encrypted or conducted on frequencies outside the scanner's range. But on the evening following the extraordinary test flight, Freeman's patience with the silent device was finally rewarded. According to Freeman's account, the first intercepted transmissions began around 8:30 in the evening, as base operations shifted into their most sensitive nighttime phase. The communications were brief and fragmented, often lasting only a few seconds before encryption systems engaged or frequencies changed. But the fragments Freeman managed to record provided glimpses into operations that seemed to confirm his most extraordinary observations. The initial transmission that caught Freeman's attention was a brief exchange about specimen transport protocols between what appeared to be security personnel and an unknown facility. The conversation referenced environmental containment requirements and biometric monitoring systems in ways that suggested the subjects being discussed were living beings rather than inanimate objects. Freeman's pulse quickened as he realized he might be overhearing communications related to the small figures he had observed being escorted between buildings. Freeman's radio equipment, while limited in capability, allowed him to record brief segments of the clearest transmissions. The fragments he captured included references to project designations that matched no known military programs. Blue Shadow Protocol was mentioned multiple times in connection with underground transport schedules. Vector analysis was discussed in contexts that seemed unrelated to conventional aircraft. Testing. The most intriguing intercepted communications involved what appeared to be technical discussions about propulsion systems that operated on principles Freeman couldn't understand. References to gravitational field modulation and space-time distortion measurements suggested research programs that pushed far beyond the boundaries of publicly acknowledged physics. The casual way these concepts were discussed implied familiarity with technology that would revolutionize human understanding of energy and motion. Freeman's archaeological background had taught him to piece together incomplete information from fragmentary evidence. The radio transmissions, while brief and often unclear, formed patterns that reinforced his visual observations of unusual activities at the base. Project code names appeared repeatedly in different contexts, suggesting ongoing research programs with scope and duration that went far beyond typical military testing cycles. One particularly revealing transmission fragment referenced artifact analysis schedules and material composition studies in ways that implied the examination of objects whose origins were unknown or disputed. The careful scheduling and specialized analysis protocols suggested items that required extraordinary security measures and scientific expertise to understand safely. Freeman noted that many of the intercepted communications occurred during periods when surface activity was minimal, reinforcing his theory that the most sensitive operations were conducted underground or during hours when observation would be most difficult. The timing correlation between radio traffic and the strange vibrations he felt through the ground suggested that communication and operational activities were closely coordinated. The security protocols mentioned in the radio transmissions exceeded anything Freeman had observed in conventional military contexts. References to Level 7 clearance and compartmented access requirements suggested classification levels that went beyond standard secret or top secret designations. Some conversations mentioned cognitive security briefings and memory protocol compliance in ways that implied psychological conditioning of personnel involved in sensitive programs. Freeman's most disturbing intercept involved a brief discussion of containment breach procedures and exposure protocol implementation. The conversation suggested that Area 51 housed materials or entities that posed risks requiring immediate response capabilities. Whether these risks were biological, technological, or something more exotic remained unclear from the fragmentary communications. The technical vocabulary used in many transmissions included terms that Freeman couldn't find in any scientific literature he was familiar with. Quantum resonance calibration and dimensional stability monitoring were discussed as routine maintenance activities. Temporal displacement measurements were referenced in connection with what appeared to be testing schedules for experimental systems. Freeman's growing realization that he was overhearing communications about technology decades or centuries ahead of public knowledge created a psychological burden that was almost overwhelming. Each intercepted fragment reinforced his conviction that Area 51 housed discoveries that would fundamentally alter human understanding of physics, biology, and perhaps the nature of reality itself. The radio traffic patterns Freeman observed suggested a highly compartmentalized operation where different teams worked on separate aspects of larger programs without full knowledge of the overall objectives. Communication between groups was carefully controlled, with most exchanges limited to specific technical requirements rather than broader discussions of purpose or implications. Some of the most intriguing transmissions involved coordination with facilities that appeared to be located far from Area 51. References to Site 7 logistics and Dulce transport schedules suggested a network of installations connected by secure communication links and regular transfer of personnel or materials. The scope of such a network implied resources and organization that went far beyond a single test facility. Freeman's attempts to record longer segments of the intercepted communications were frustrated by the sophisticated security measures employed by base personnel. Frequency changes occurred unpredictably, encryption systems engaged without warning, and transmission times were kept deliberately brief to minimize interception opportunities. The few clear recordings Freeman managed to obtain would later prove tantalizing but inconclusive when subjected to technical analysis. The casual efficiency with which extraordinary concepts were discussed in the radio transmissions provided perhaps the most convincing evidence that Freeman was overhearing genuine operational communications rather than training exercises. Or disinformation. References to alien metallurgy samples and non-human biological specimens were made with the matter-of-fact tone of routine work rather than the excitement or skepticism such topics would generate in normal, scientific contexts. As Freeman's week inside the restricted zone drew toward its conclusion, the intercepted radio communications had provided the final piece of evidence he needed to understand the true scope of Area 51's operations. Whether the technology being discussed was of human or extraterrestrial origin, it represented capabilities that remained hidden from public knowledge by security measures more sophisticated than anything he had previously imagined. The voices in the desert had spoken of wonders and terrors that challenged every assumption Freeman held about the limits of human knowledge and the nature of reality itself. As he prepared for the dangerous journey back to civilization, Freeman knew that the burden of what he had heard would weigh on him for the rest of his life. Chapter 12. The Underground Facility. Freeman's most audacious decision came during his final night inside the restricted zone, when desperation for conclusive evidence overcame his survival instincts. According to his account, the combination of extraordinary observations and fragmentary radio intercepts had convinced him that the true secrets of Area 51 lay not in the surface facilities he could observe, but in the hidden chambers that extended deep beneath the Nevada desert. The opportunity for underground exploration presented itself when Freeman discovered what appeared to be a maintenance access point during his reconnaissance of the base's outer perimeter. The entrance was disguised as a ventilation shaft, with a metal grate that seemed designed to blend with the rocky terrain. But Freeman's careful observation revealed that the opening was larger than necessary for simple air circulation and showed signs of recent human use. Freeman's decision to attempt entry into the underground facility represented the culmination of a week's worth of increasingly risky behavior. His archaeological background had taught him that the most significant discoveries often required exploring areas that others avoided or overlooked. But the decision to enter a restricted military installation's hidden passages went far beyond anything in his previous experience. According to Freeman's detailed account, the maintenance shaft descended approximately 20 feet through what appeared to be natural rock before opening into a corridor that was clearly artificial construction. The passage was wider than a typical maintenance tunnel, with smooth walls that showed evidence of sophisticated engineering and construction techniques. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination that allowed limited navigation without requiring additional light sources that might betray an intruder's presence. Freeman's exploration of the underground corridor system lasted approximately 2 hours, during which he claimed to have accessed multiple levels and observed facilities that defied his ability to understand their purpose. The passages were arranged in a grid pattern that suggested systematic planning and construction over an extended period. Access routes connected chambers of varying sizes, some large enough to house aircraft, others configured as what appeared to be laboratory or research spaces. The equipment Freeman observed during his underground exploration included devices and systems that operated according to principles he couldn't identify. Some chambers contained what appeared to be particle accelerators or energy generation systems, but with configurations that didn't match any technology Freeman was familiar with. Other rooms housed what seemed to be biological research equipment, with containment systems and monitoring devices that suggested work with specimens requiring extraordinary safety precautions. Freeman's most disturbing discovery was a series of chambers that appeared to be configured for long-term storage or containment of objects whose nature he couldn't determine. The rooms were equipped with environmental control systems, security monitoring, and what appeared to be energy field generators that created barriers around central storage areas. The level of protection suggested contents that were either extremely valuable or potentially dangerous. The underground facility's scale exceeded anything Freeman had imagined based on his surface observations. Corridors extended in directions that would place them far beyond the visible boundaries of the base, suggesting a subterranean complex that might encompass hundreds of square miles. The construction quality and sophisticated life support systems indicated resources and planning that went far beyond conventional military installations. Freeman's navigation through the underground passages was guided by his archaeological experience with mapping complex sites, but the artificial nature of the construction created challenges he hadn't anticipated. The uniform appearance of corridors made orientation difficult, and the absence of natural landmarks required careful attention to maintain directional awareness. Emergency lighting provided minimal illumination that made detailed observation challenging while preserving the night vision necessary for safe movement. The most technologically advanced areas Freeman claimed to have accessed were deeper underground, reached through elevators and transport systems that operated silently and required no visible controls. These lower levels housed equipment that seemed decades or centuries ahead of anything in public scientific knowledge. Energy systems that generated no heat or electromagnetic signatures, computing devices that used principles beyond conventional electronics, and manufacturing equipment that appeared to manipulate matter at the molecular level. Freeman's psychological response to the underground exploration was a mixture of wonder and overwhelming anxiety. The technology he observed challenged every assumption he held about the limits of human scientific achievement. Yet the sophisticated security measures and compartmentalized access protocols suggested that such capabilities remained hidden from public knowledge for reasons that might involve national security, economic stability, or more fundamental concerns about human readiness for such advances. The biological research areas Freeman claimed to have observed were equipped with containment systems that suggested work with specimens requiring protection from contamination or escape. The chambers included what appeared to be suspended animation systems genetic analysis equipment, and monitoring devices that tracked biological functions in real time. The level of sophistication suggested research programs that pushed far beyond publicly acknowledged capabilities in biotechnology and life sciences. Freeman's most unnerving discovery was a chamber that appeared to house recovered artifacts of unknown origin. The objects were suspended in energy fields that prevented direct contact while allowing detailed examination through sophisticated analysis equipment. Some artifacts appeared to be fragments of larger devices, while others seemed to be complete systems whose purpose remained unclear. The careful preservation and intensive study suggested materials that were considered invaluable for technological development. The underground facility's communication systems included equipment that Freeman couldn't identify or understand. Some devices appeared to be quantum communication arrays. Others resembled systems for deep space monitoring or transmission. The scope and sophistication of the communication infrastructure suggested coordination with facilities and perhaps entities that were not based on Earth. Freeman's retreat from the underground facility was necessitated by the approach of what appeared to be a security patrol conducting routine checks of the lower levels. His escape through the maintenance shaft required careful timing and physical effort that left him exhausted and psychologically strained. The knowledge that he had penetrated one of the most secure installations in the world created a mixture of pride and terror that would affect his mental state for months afterward. The brief exploration of Area 51's hidden chambers had provided Freeman with evidence that the facility housed technology and research programs that remained decades or centuries ahead of public scientific knowledge. Whether the discoveries represented human innovation or recovered extraterrestrial technology, they suggested capabilities that could revolutionize every aspect of human civilization if ever released from their classified status. As Freeman prepared for his final day inside the restricted zone and the dangerous journey back to civilization, the images of the underground facility would remain burned into his memory as proof that reality extended far beyond anything acknowledged in public discourse about science, technology, and humanity's place in the universe. Chapter 13: The Decision to Leave. Freeman's 8th morning inside the restricted zone began with a profound sense that his extraordinary week was reaching its natural conclusion. According to his account, the combination of accumulated stress, physical exhaustion, and psychological pressure from his discoveries had pushed him to the limits of what one person could endure while maintaining the alertness necessary for survival in such a hostile environment. The decision to end his infiltration mission was influenced by several factors that had been building throughout his final days inside Area 51. Freeman's water supplies, despite careful rationing and the cached reserves he had positioned during his preparation phase, were running dangerously low. The high-energy food bars that had sustained him for over a week were nearly exhausted, and his physical condition was deteriorating in ways that threatened his ability to make the arduous journey back to safety. More troubling than the physical challenges were the psychological effects Freeman attributed to his extended exposure to whatever exotic technologies operated within the base. According to his later testimony, he had begun experiencing vivid dreams that seemed more like memories than normal sleep imagery. These nocturnal experiences included detailed visions of the underground chambers he had explored, but with perspectives and information that seemed beyond what he could have observed during his brief infiltration. Freeman described waking from these dreams with knowledge of technical processes and scientific principles that were far beyond his educational background. the sensation of understanding concepts related to gravitational manipulation, quantum field dynamics, and biological systems that operated according to unknown principles created a cognitive dissonance that was deeply disturbing. Whether these experiences represented genuine information transfer or psychological breakdown remained unclear. The strange sensations Freeman experienced during his final days included physical symptoms that suggested possible exposure to exotic radiation or electromagnetic fields, persistent headaches, minor skin irritation, and an unusual metallic taste that seemed to intensify when he was closest to the base's operational areas. All pointed to environmental factors that might pose long-term health risks. His archaeological training had familiarized him with the dangers of exposure to unknown materials, and the symptoms suggested that immediate medical evaluation might be necessary. Freeman's growing paranoia about advanced surveillance technologies detecting his presence had reached levels that threatened his ability to function effectively. Every sound seemed amplified and potentially threatening. Visual anomalies that might have been heat distortion or optical illusions took on sinister significance as possible signs of detection equipment he couldn't understand. The psychological pressure of believing he was being monitored by technologies beyond his comprehension created stress levels that were becoming unsustainable. The most compelling reason for Freeman's decision to leave was his growing conviction that his presence had been detected through methods he couldn't identify or counter. The systematic security sweeps that had nearly discovered his position were continuing on a daily basis, with patterns that suggested the search teams were operating from specific intelligence rather than conducting random patrols. Whether this intelligence came from conventional detection systems or more exotic surveillance methods, the result was the same. His continued presence posed increasing risks of capture. Freeman's internal debate about extending his mission centered on the extraordinary nature of his discoveries and the possibility that additional time might yield even more significant observations. The underground facility he had briefly explored contained chambers and equipment that would require months of study to understand fully. The radio communications he had intercepted suggested ongoing projects whose scope and implications demanded longer observation periods to document adequately. Yet, the risks of continued infiltration were becoming prohibitive. Freeman's physical condition was deteriorating, his psychological state was increasingly unstable, and the security measures around his position were intensifying. The knowledge that capture would mean not only personal disaster, but also the complete suppression of the evidence he had gathered weighed heavily in his decision-making process. Freeman's final night inside the restricted zone was marked by the most intense underground activity he had observed during his entire week-long mission. The vibrations transmitted through the desert floor were stronger and more complex than anything he had previously experienced. The radio traffic increased dramatically, with communications that suggested major operations involving multiple underground facilities and coordination with external locations. The temptation to remain for one more day to observe whatever extraordinary activities were being conducted in the hidden chambers beneath Area 51 was almost overwhelming. Freeman's archaeological instincts told him that he was on the verge of discoveries that could revolutionize human understanding of technology, biology, and perhaps the nature of reality itself. But his survival instincts, honed through years of desert exploration and reinforced by a week of constant danger, argued for immediate withdrawal while escape was still possible. Freeman's ultimate decision to leave was influenced by a practical consideration that overrode all other factors. His cached water supplies would sustain him for the return journey if he began immediately, but any delay would create life-threatening dehydration risks during the trek back to his vehicle. The desert that had concealed his approach would become a death trap if he lacked the physical resources necessary for the demanding return route. The psychological toll of his discoveries also played a crucial role in Freeman's decision. The technology he had observed, the beings he claimed to have witnessed, and the implications of ongoing contact between human and non-human intelligence created mental burdens that threatened his psychological stability. Freeman realized that processing such extraordinary information would require time, distance, and possibly professional support that could only be obtained outside the pressure environment of the restricted zone. Freeman's preparation for departure involved carefully destroying any evidence of his presence that might compromise future research or endanger other individuals who might attempt similar infiltrations. His waste materials were buried, his observation positions were restored to their natural appearance, and his equipment was checked to ensure nothing would be left behind that could reveal his methods or identity. As Freeman took his final look at Area 51 from his concealed position in the mining shelter, the facility appeared deceptively normal in the early morning light. The extraordinary activities he had witnessed, the technology that defied conventional understanding, and the beings that challenged assumptions about humanity's place in the universe were all hidden beneath a facade of routine military operations. Freeman's week inside America's most secret facility had yielded observations that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Whether his discoveries represented genuine contact with extraterrestrial intelligence or exposure to human technology decades ahead of public knowledge, they had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality's boundaries. The journey home would begin with a single step away from the greatest archaeological discovery in human history. Chapter 14. The Escape. Freeman's departure from Area 51 began in the pre-dawn darkness of his 8th day. When the base's activities had settled into their quietest phase, and the security patrols were following their most predictable patterns, according to his account, the decision to leave during this window was based on careful observation of the facility's rhythms and his assessment that detection risks were at their lowest during the transition between night and day operations. The initial phase of Freeman's escape route retraced the path he had used for his most dangerous reconnaissance missions, following the network of drainage culverts and dry washes that provided concealed movement corridors. But the psychological pressure of his situation had transformed familiar terrain into a landscape filled with potential threats. Every shadow seemed to conceal surveillance equipment. Every sound suggested approaching security patrols. Freeman's physical condition, after 8 days of minimal food, rationed water, and constant stress, made the demanding journey significantly more difficult than his original approach had been. The energy bars and dried fruit that had sustained him throughout the week had provided sufficient calories for survival, but not enough for the physical demands of cross-country movement through rough desert terrain. His muscles felt weak and unresponsive, his coordination was impaired by dehydration, and his mental clarity was compromised by exhaustion. The route Freeman chose for his escape took advantage of terrain features he had identified during his preparation phase, but avoiding the exact path of his approach in case security forces had discovered evidence of his infiltration route. The alternative course required longer travel through more exposed areas, but Freeman believed the reduced predictability would offset the increased visibility risks. Freeman's most harrowing moments during the escape occurred approximately 2 hours after leaving his shelter, when helicopter activity over the restricted zone increased dramatically. According to his account, multiple aircraft began conducting systematic search patterns that seemed designed to locate something specific rather than conducting routine patrols. The search areas overlapped the regions Freeman needed to cross to reach safety, forcing him to take cover repeatedly and slowing his progress when speed was essential. The helicopter searches followed grid patterns that suggested coordination from a central command post with detailed knowledge of the terrain and potential escape routes. Freeman found himself pinned down in inadequate concealment while aircraft passed directly overhead, their searchlights sweeping methodically across the desert floor. The intensity and persistence of the aerial activity convinced Freeman that his presence had been detected and that security forces were actively hunting for him. Freeman's survival during the helicopter searches depended on techniques he had learned during years of wildlife observation and archaeological fieldwork. Remaining motionless under minimal cover, controlling his breathing to avoid creating visible vapor clouds in the cool morning air, and timing his movements to coincide with aircraft noise that would mask any sounds he might make. Each period of concealment felt like hours, though Freeman's watch indicated that the searches lasted only minutes before moving to other areas. The psychological impact of being hunted by military security forces while physically weakened and mentally exhausted pushed Freeman to the edge of panic. The knowledge that capture would mean arrest, imprisonment, and the complete suppression of his discoveries created a level of stress that threatened his ability to make rational decisions about concealment and movement. Freeman later described fighting off waves of paranoid thoughts about advanced detection technologies that might locate him regardless of his concealment efforts. Freeman's water situation became critical during the extended escape, as the repeated delays caused by helicopter activity prevented him from reaching the cached supplies he had positioned along his planned route. Dehydration symptoms, including dizziness, muscle cramps, and impaired judgment, made navigation increasingly difficult. The desert that had seemed manageable during his approach now felt like a hostile environment designed to claim his life. The most terrifying aspect of Freeman's escape was his growing conviction that the security forces pursuing him possessed detection capabilities that went beyond conventional military technology. The persistence and accuracy of the helicopter searches suggested surveillance systems that could track human movement through methods Freeman couldn't understand. Whether these capabilities were based on advanced radar, thermal imaging, or more exotic technologies, they seemed capable of locating concealed individuals across vast areas of desert terrain. Freeman's breakthrough came when the helicopter activity suddenly ceased around midday, as if the search had been called off or redirected to other areas. The unexpected respite allowed him to resume movement toward his vehicle, though the fear of renewed pursuit made every step feel exposed and dangerous. Freeman pushed himself beyond his physical limits, driven by the knowledge that safety lay only a few miles ahead, but required crossing the most challenging terrain of his entire journey. The final approach to Freeman's hidden vehicle took him across open ground where concealment was impossible and detection would be certain if security forces resumed their search. Freeman later described this phase of his escape as the longest 30 minutes of his life, crossing exposed terrain while expecting helicopter rotors to appear on the horizon at any moment. His archaeological training had not prepared him for the psychological pressure of believing that military forces were actively hunting him with technology he couldn't understand or counter. Freeman's arrival at his concealed pickup truck represented more than just reaching safety. It marked his transition from the hidden world of Area 51 back to the ordinary reality of highways, gas stations, and normal human society. The contrast was so profound that Freeman initially questioned whether his week inside the restricted zone had actually occurred, or whether isolation and stress had created elaborate hallucinations that felt more real than memory. The drive to Las Vegas provided Freeman with his first opportunity in over a week to process the extraordinary observations he had made and begin planning how to document and share his discoveries. But the transition from survival mode to normal social functioning proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The knowledge he carried about advanced technology, non-human entities, and government activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality created a psychological burden that would affect him for years to come. Freeman's immediate priority, upon reaching civilization, was medical evaluation and documentation of his experiences, while the details remained fresh in his memory. The potential health effects of exposure to unknown technologies, the psychological impact of his discoveries, and the legal implications of his infiltration all required careful consideration and professional consultation. As Freeman checked into a Las Vegas hotel room and began the process of documenting his week inside America's most secret facility, the desert night outside his window seemed impossibly ordinary compared to the hidden world he had left behind. The transition from observer of impossible technologies to ordinary citizen would prove to be one of the most challenging aspects of his entire experience. Chapter 15: The Aftermath and Questions. Freeman's return to normal life in Phoenix proved far more difficult than his week-long infiltration of Area 51 had been. According to his account, the psychological burden of carrying knowledge about advanced technology, non-human entities, and government activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality created isolation that was more profound than any physical danger he had faced in the Nevada desert. The initial documentation of Freeman's experiences consumed 3 weeks of intensive writing, sketching, and map-making as he attempted to record every detail while the memories remained fresh. His archaeological training in field documentation served him well, but the extraordinary nature of his observations created challenges that normal site recording had never presented. How do you accurately describe technology that operates according to unknown principles? How do you document beings whose physiology defies conventional biology? Freeman's detailed maps and technical drawings aligned remarkably well with known features of Area 51 that had been revealed through satellite photography and declassified documents. His descriptions of hangar layouts, road systems, and perimeter security matched information that wasn't publicly available during his 1997 infiltration, but was later confirmed through other sources. These correlations provided the strongest evidence supporting the credibility of his account. Yet other aspects of Freeman's documentation described facilities and activities that couldn't be verified through any independent source. The extensive underground complex, the advanced propulsion systems, and the non-human entities existed only in Freeman's testimony and the fragmentary evidence he had managed to collect. Without photographs, recordings, or physical samples, these claims remained in the realm of speculation rather than documented fact. Freeman's attempts to share his discoveries with the scientific community met with responses ranging from polite skepticism to outright ridicule. Academic archaeologists questioned why he had abandoned legitimate research for what they characterized as conspiracy theories and trespassing. Physics professors dismissed his descriptions of gravitational manipulation and space-time distortion as science fiction rather than observed phenomena. The professional isolation was devastating for a man who had spent his career seeking acceptance from the academic establishment. The UFO research community's reaction to Freeman's account was more receptive but created its own complications. Investigators hungry for evidence of extraterrestrial contact embraced his testimony as validation of their beliefs, often embellishing or misrepresenting his claims to support their own theories. Freeman found himself caught between scientists who rejected his observations entirely and believers who transformed his careful documentation into sensationalized stories that bore little resemblance to his actual experiences. Freeman's most disturbing post-infiltration experiences involved what he characterized as government harassment, designed to discredit his testimony and discourage further research into Area 51's activities. According to his claims, these activities began within weeks of his return and continued for several years. Phone calls with heavy breathing or electronic interference, unexplained surveillance of his home and workplace, and administrative problems with government agencies that had never affected him previously. The alleged harassment escalated to include break-ins, where nothing was stolen but Freeman's research materials were disturbed, suggesting that intruders were photographing or copying his documentation rather than attempting theft. His personal computer experienced repeated crashes and data corruption that professional technicians couldn't explain. Mail delivery became unreliable, particularly for correspondence related to his Area 51 experiences. Freeman's employment at the county surveyor's office became increasingly problematic as his UFO-related activities attracted unwanted attention. Colleagues, who had previously respected his archaeological expertise, began treating him as an eccentric whose judgment couldn't be trusted. His supervisor received anonymous complaints about Freeman's reliability and professionalism. The cumulative pressure eventually forced him to seek employment elsewhere, disrupting a career that had been stable for over 15 years. The psychological impact of Freeman's experiences extended far beyond professional difficulties. The knowledge that reality was far stranger and more complex than publicly acknowledged created a sense of living in two worlds simultaneously. Freeman could function in normal society, maintaining conversations about weather and sports, while carrying memories of technology that could revolutionize human civilization and encounters with beings from other worlds. Freeman's relationships with family and friends deteriorated as his Area 51 experiences dominated his thoughts and conversations. People who had once enjoyed his company began avoiding him as his stories became repetitive and his behavior increasingly obsessive. The isolation reinforced his conviction that he was carrying a burden too important to abandon, but too controversial to share, without severe personal consequences. The question of Freeman's credibility became a subject of intense debate within UFO research circles, and remained unresolved decades after his alleged infiltration. Supporters pointed to the accuracy of his base descriptions, the technical sophistication of his observations, and the consistency of his account over many years of retelling. They argued that the harassment he experienced provided circumstantial evidence that his discoveries had threatened powerful interests. Skeptics questioned whether Freeman's account represented genuine observation, elaborate fabrication, or psychological breakdown caused by isolation and stress. The absence of photographic evidence, despite his claims of carrying camera equipment, raised questions about his commitment to documentation. The increasingly exotic nature of his claims, from advanced aircraft to non-human entities, suggested a progression that might indicate fantasy rather than fact. The most troubling aspect of Freeman's case for objective researchers was the impossibility of verification. Area 51's security made independent confirmation of his claims virtually impossible. Even if other infiltrators succeeded in reaching the base, they would face the same documentation challenges that had limited Freeman's evidence collection. The facility's classification levels ensured that official confirmation or denial would never be forthcoming. Freeman's legacy within UFO research became that of a controversial figure whose account contained elements that seemed credible alongside claims that challenged belief. His detailed knowledge of base operations and security procedures suggested genuine infiltration experience. Yet, his descriptions of exotic technology and alien entities placed his testimony in the same category as other unverifiable alien contact stories. As Freeman aged, the burden of his experiences took an increasing psychological toll. The isolation from former colleagues, the skepticism of researchers, and the alleged harassment from government sources created a combination of stress factors that affected his mental and physical health. Whether his deteriorating condition resulted from the natural consequences of carrying such extraordinary secrets, or from more direct intervention, remained an open question. The ultimate truth of Freeman's week inside Area 51 may never be definitively established. His account exists in the grey area between documented fact and unverifiable testimony that characterizes much of UFO research. Whether he was a courageous truth-teller who risked everything to reveal hidden realities, a skilled fabricator who created an elaborate hoax, or simply a man who spent too long alone in the desert, seeing what his mind wanted him to see remains a question that each reader must answer for themselves. What cannot be disputed is that Freeman's story, true or false, captures the enduring human fascination with the unknown and the possibility that reality contains mysteries far stranger than anything acknowledged in official discourse. In the end, perhaps that fascination itself is more important than the question of whether one man's extraordinary claims can ever be proven true. And so we reach the end of Jerry Freeman's remarkable tale. Rest well and dream of possibilities that stretch beyond the horizon of the known world.